for 5, and I'm going to talk now about the other aspect of the brain gym. The one that I had to slip in because it was discovered late in the game, so it's kind of a funny placement. It's in the brain gym, but these are the brain networks. Before I do that, do you have any questions about the basic 4 categories of exercise? Yeah.
I might have missed this, but if you were doing strength and coordination
yes.
for this lady,
yes.
Can you tweak, you can make strength lower,
yes.
and you could make coordination a little bit higher? Or is it the same?
You mean on the light intensity?
Yeah.
Because she's reported a history of migraines, because she describes herself as photosensitive, I would do everything at a lower light intensity regardless of the goal.
But for anyone you can tweak it so that one might be higher, one might be lower?
Well, we mean within the brain gym or in general?
Brain gym, but actually generally.
Well, do you mean that the same person, but you would use different light intensities at different times depending? Generally not. You normally find a range that a person seems to respond well to. And the only real variable might be the ambient light at the time. Right? If the room is dark, then I would recommend whatever, let's say you generally do it at 10%. If the room is really dark, I would take it down to maybe 6%, because you know it's going to seem a lot brighter. If it's bright sunshine noon and you've got light coming through that you can't block, take it up a few percent because you're competing with the sunshine. Other than that, what you're going to, like for me, almost all, I've 15-20% is what I do. I mean, I'm good at that. I'm good. And if I'm working with a session that is more excitatory, maybe I'll tap it down a little. Or if I'm tired, I just don't really feel like, riding the bull, but I want to do a session, okay, I'll tap it down a little bit. But if if the room is bright and it's 10 o'clock in the morning and I'm feeling pretty good and, I'm looking toward, but you're going to find a range that feels, it's like listening to music, you're going to find a volume, regardless of the song, unless it's an unusual mood, you're going to find it's like, when you take a shower, how hot do you like the water? Or when you drink tea, there's a biological window that everybody has for stimulation. And you're going to discover that for most people in a neutral ambience with the light not too far, not too close, 10, 15 to 20% is pretty much where you're going to be. It's rare to go above 20%, I have found, unless it's a very bright room. It's more typical to take it down than it is to take it up.
Are there any other symptoms that you should ask similar to the migraines and the...
Well, obviously, right from the very beginning, and if you're going to do it with the public, you should have a form. Are you prone to have you had seizures or have you been diagnosed with epilepsy? If so, the light is contraindicated. Fortunately, with the Neurolight, you can do the brain food and the sound.
For seizure and epilepsy.
For people that are light sensitive for any reason. If the light is the problem, you don't get the full composition, but you're still able to influence them in a positive way.
Okay.
Like there are people that are sleep sensitive, and the wavelength of the LEDs is in the cool blue white. That wavelength, which is basically sky blue daylight, is well known in the evening to inhibit the pineal gland from secreting melatonin, which you need to sleep. So if somebody is sleep sensitive, I don't recommend them doing Neurolight sessions in the evening, especially near to sleep time, because regardless of the signaling, the wavelength can disrupt melatonin production in the pineal. That's just common sense. So for people that are sleep issued, what I do is I have them do the session early in the day, if possible, use the brain food, and then in the evening, I'll take whatever the session, it's usually something like Mind Tranquil or something, some of the sessions that help people move into sleep, and I have them do 22 minutes of the sound. So they get the session, they get the stimulation, it's guiding the brain, it's teaching the brain to move towards that sleep state, but you're using the audio signaling instead of the photonic signaling. Because, and there's a big controversy now about all the new LED lights, in the house, and that those wavelengths are stimulatory. They're telling the pineal gland it's daytime, it's not nighttime. So the LEDs here are cool blue white. It has a whole bunch of around about 460 nanometers, which is the magic one for the melanopsin to trigger into the pineal, to tell the pineal do not secrete melatonin, it's daytime. So some people, they can drink a double espresso and go to bed and boom, they're asleep. Somebody else, if it's past noon, 3 a.m., they still can't sleep. So we have these biological sensitivities that have variables in them. And for some people, they can do a Neurolight session with the light in the evening and go to sleep after that. There's no problem. So it's not a hard, fast rule, but you have to be recognizing that there are different degrees of what's called the threshold of stimulation. That some of us have a low threshold of stimulation. It takes a very low amount of stimulation to create excitation. Some of us have a high threshold. It takes a lot of stimulation to trigger excitation. And it roughly parallels introverts and extroverts, although not exactly, because you can have pathology on top of that. Okay? Okay. Brain networks. You may recall, excuse me, that's a device to build attention. So when you create you start to promise and then you create the pregnant pause.
Is that back on?
I don't know. Is it on? Deb, is the camera on?
Yeah.
Thank you. So, what we're going to talk about now is still the brain gym. Oh. That's why you're all blurry. When I was building the sanctuary for the gibbons last year, I got sunstroke because I thought I was a tough guy and I could work with everybody else. And then after that, suddenly my eyes, there's a challenge. So I got driving glasses and now I'm trying to figure out what the hell to do. Do I get progressives or what? There we go. Okay. We're in the brain gym, but we're not dealing with the isolated exercises. We're dealing with the brain network reinforcements. You may recall earlier how I said I thought everything was done. Then I found this research. It was extremely important. It's revolutionary, actually. And I decided that I really had to develop compositions based on them, but because of the nature of the software interface, it would have been a really big task to create a new third category, brain gym and brain ball something, brain networks and brain skills. We said, okay, we'll just put them in the brain gym. So don't be surprised when you open up the brain gym, the first thing you see is assessment. That's the thing here. You're not going to use it that much, but you can use it and you'll like it. Mostly it helps people feel really confident that you're doing something that is impressive. Usually it's just a way of clarifying your own subjective assessment. I got to be truthful. I trust you that much, because why not? So we had to put the brain network somewhere, so we just put them there. So when you go in the brain gym, the first thing you see is assessment, because it's alpha, it's there because it's A. Then you see T for training. That's where you go in to do the thing we just did with Joan. And then under that you see a list of 7 brain networks. and they're alphabetical. So we're going to talk about those right now. The early principles in brain anatomy and physiology involved this thing called localization. It was a really, really big stage of discovery to realize that there are certain locations in the brain that were dedicated to certain functions. It's the principle called localization. And it was a huge advance in neurophysiology, neuroscience for the brain to understand that. And there are all kinds of famous stories about how they came across those things. More recently than that is the realization that these local areas of special function also will, on demand, join together to make special teams. So the analogy, the lame analogy that I use, is that they don't work together, but they get together after work to have a drink. They work in different companies, but they get together separately because they have an association that may not be apparent. So areas in the brain that you would never think would be associating with each other join together in these networks. It's really an amazing advancement in cranial neurology to realize that there are these networks, these places that get together that nobody ever thought they had anything to do with each other. And now as they're discovered, there's even the realization that there's a lot of hidden hardware, that they're actually hardwired together, but in ways that were never discovered before. That they have these cables, in a sense, these big neural bundles that allow them to do this. Because we have to appreciate, and we've given hints of it, the extraordinary complexity of the brain. It's beyond complex. I don't know, it's like complex to the power of 10 complex. So, amazingly, the signaling that goes on in the brain dances right up to the edge of chaos. Chaos sounds bad, but what chaos means, lack of order, which means it's much less biased to do anything. It's kind of open-minded at that time because there's not any particular, it dances right, it doesn't go into pure chaos, but right to the edge of chaos. And it has to jump from this extraordinary, near chaotic complexity into temporary order and then back out of that again. And it's doing it in fractions of a second, milliseconds, right now. So how in the world can it get, with all those synapses and all those neurons and more than stars in the sky, they say, as though we know how many stars there are in the sky. How does it go from near complexity to temporary order and out of it so quickly all the time? Well, there's a bridge from near chaos to temporary order, and those are the networks. The networks are these neurological bridges that allow incredible chaotic complexity to come into temporary order for the sake of function, and then release that back into potential chaos again. That's what they're bridges. That's my analogy. These networks are bridges. Right now, there are, according to my best efforts, there have been 9 that are recognized, 7 that are well understood, an 8th that is becoming understood, and one that was announced just 2 months ago. They recognize the components, but they don't know the dynamics, and this one is called the consciousness network. And it deals with the interactions of the areas in the brain that are in part dealing with alertedness, in part dealing with sustained attention, and in part dealing with focus. And they see these areas that have those involvements actually coordinating themselves, and they think that this network forms the basis of what we generally call conscious awareness. Now, I don't know. But that's number 9. Number 8 is the
Sorry, you said alertness, sustained attention, and what was the third?
focus.
Focus.
Right.
Alertness?
Alertedness, attention, focus is my recollection. Now, that's number 9. Number 8 is the somatosensory. The somatosensory. It's recognized, by the way, different countries have slightly different names for these things, but the names I use are the common ones used in most of the academic research in the US, okay? So don't be surprised if you see a slightly variable expression, but the names are evolving. The somato means body. The somatosensory network is recognized, but it was not included in that study of the frequency harmonics that I was able to access. So that one is not in the list. So there are 9. Number 8 is recognized reasonably well and being understood, but I don't have the frequency harmonics on it, so it's not there. The consciousness network is now just being proposed as a discovery, but they haven't confirmed it yet. Because these are multi-center research, not just one group does it and everybody believes it. They have to be reinforced and replicated. So, 7. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about each one and some amount about how to use it. And it's 4:30 right now, so this will take about a half an hour. Fair enough? You got enough juice? Jessica?
Yes.
Atta girl. Okay. There are 2 that associate with each other. I think of them as 2 people and 1 chair. That means either you're in the chair or you're not. They're exclusionary. When one is working, the other is not. So they're exclusionary. One is called the default mode network. Now, you gotta think, just by its name, that you have an idea about its characteristic. It's the default mode. It means, and why it's called that, when your brain, when you are not involved in a particular task, the default mode network is dominant.
This is number 7.
This is number 1. This is 1 of 7.
Oh.
These are the 7 that are in the brain gym.
So you went from 9 to 8 to 1.
I say that there are 7 in the brain gym. There is a number 8 that's recognized, but I don't have the frequency harmonics on it, so I couldn't create a composition.
Okay.
That's number 8. Number 9 is newly hypothesized. It's been recognized, but it's not understood. That's the consciousness network. That's the name some people are giving it. So there's no information on that. I wish a lot that I had that, but I don't. I also don't have the information for the somatosensory, although it's recognized, but they didn't include that in the research. The research explored 7 of the they're the primary, they're the ones that everybody knows about. And I have the research. Because of that, I was able to create the compositions. So now I'm going to talk about the 7 that you have in the Neurolite. And I'm listing them in this order partially out of convenience. Okay? And you'll see why when I talk about it. I could talk about them in any order. But These first two are good to talk about together because it's one or the other. And these are extremely important networks. The default mode network is what takes over when you're not involved in a specific task. That's why it's called the default mode. When you're not doing something, you're in the default mode. And what the default mode does is it allows for daydreaming, reflection, just kind of sensing emotional states. It's even dominant when you're listening to a good story or watching a movie or listening to a tune. When you don't have task, this doesn't mean meditation, by the way, at all. The default mode is, you've been out there all day, like you're doing this thing, and you go home or wherever you're staying, you go in, you close the door, you sit back, and you go, it's like it's home. It doesn't mean you're in meditation. It's not some kind of exalted, serene state. It allows you to reflect, think about the day. It's when there's no purposeful task, the default mode network takes over. That's why it's called the default mode. And it's extremely important. People in neuroscience that work with psychiatry have a particular interpretation. They say that the default mode network is the primary configuration of signal activity that generates the feeling called me. Me. That feeling that I exist. The I, the ego, call it whatever you want, it's not negative as ego, but they say that the integrity of this network is required to have a sense of identity, the feeling of me. And it's an extraordinarily fascinating thing because, I'll give you a few examples. The default mode network degrades into dysfunction progressively in autism. It also degrades in Alzheimer's. And in both of those cases, what you can see is that self-identification, that thing called me has a lot of variability, that it is not cohesive, that it can vary greatly, the me, the I. And the fact that in autism and Alzheimer's, radically different states, but both have a challenge around identity. Both have a big challenge around the me. Like in Alzheimer's, the me can just kind of like evaporate. That whole sense of self. So the default mode network, and in light and sound, I was able from the research to get the primary frequencies, not just the frequencies, the frequency harmonics. They're harmonics like I've never seen. I'm not a musicologist. I've never seen any harmonic relationships like this. It's like, give me a break. No one would ever have guessed this. And also, it's not just the harmonics, meaning the spatial, like the relationships relative to degree, but also the degree of dominance of the particular frequencies when it's working well. So what you do is when you go into that signaling, you're actually calibrating or tuning the default mode network with its resident harmonic frequencies, frequency harmonics. That's in the Neurolight. It's crazy. The default mode network, I'll make it simple, for people that can't turn it off, that it's always on, work with the default mode network, because that's where you go in your brain when you turn it off, when there's no task. Now understand, it's not meditative, because meditative is actually a whole class of tasks. This is ruminating, reflecting, daydreaming, sort of feeling what you're feeling, but you don't really have any purpose for feeling. It's also when you watch a good story, movie, not read a book, as much as listen to a story or watch a story or listen to a tune, that you can drop into that zone and it's relieving because you're not in a task mode. That's the default mode network. That's why it's called default mode. When you're not doing something, that's the default. It's really fascinating as well because the default mode network also begins to degrade in early psychosis. It degrades in temporal lobe epilepsy. A lot of people with temporal lobe epilepsy, for example, are prone to all sorts of, but they will term precognition and visions and dreams, like waking state dreams, all these kinds of peculiar forms. And to me, one of the very most fascinating things is that the default mode network shifts out of dominance. It becomes degraded, or the word might not be dysfunctional because it's so common, during dream sleep. And haven't you noticed that in the dream state, the me is incredibly interpretable? Because you're every person in the dream. It's you wearing the costume of every person. Even the feeling of me and you and it and I, all of that is very interpretive and creative in the dream state because the default mode network is shifting out of dominance. So the whole sense of me in dream is open for interpretation. I'm me, I'm this, I'm that, I'm you, I'm her, I'm it, the I, I'm here. It's fascinating. So the default mode network is a really big deal.
That was epilepsy, and what was the other one?
Temporal lobe early stages of psychosis. We can't do it in this training, but there's an awful lot to be understood about how the brain deals with sustained threat. It's a profound topic. Limbic trauma loop, post-traumatic stress, this whole thing, paranoia, magical thinking, it's an amazing subject. And neuroplasticity is really advancing it. So that's a default mode network. And I said there are two people, one chair. The other one is called the cognitive control network. Cognitive control network. And that's the CEO. That comes on board when there's something to do. It's a task. When it's time to shift into task, cognitive control kicks the default mode out of the office chair and takes over. The cognitive control network. There's a lot of discussion about the cognitive control network in unusual states. There's this whole thing called, flow states and exceptional states, and screwing around with your cognitive control network for the reward of high states of excitation. It's a whole element. It's a whole subject in this thing called biohacking these days. A lot of people working with the concept of pushing to extreme for excellent states, and you can push the cognitive control network into modified semi-dysfunctional state, and you get a big reward because you get high-pitched alertedness. The problem is that the biochemistry that attends it ends up creating one of the most addictive states possible, self-generated addictive states. And this is like no juice on earth is addictive as this chemical cocktail. But you can push the cognitive control network into allowing all sorts of high task performance without management. So what you get is these high peak performance states. They're highly transient and highly addictive. And the more you get them, the more you want them. And the more you pursue them, the more you degrade the cognitive control network.
So these are these extreme gamers that you
all of it. You keep on going, and the rat won't stop slapping the stick.
I was going to say gambling.
On and on, on and on. Yeah, those states. So this is the nice thing about see, working with these brain networks is a whole different game than you may appreciate. Like, the brain entrainment stuff, I've already put that in my back pocket, right? And we're going to talk about the brain skills tomorrow and about the exercises. The brain network stuff, thank you. The brain network stuff, this is a different league. When you start working with the brain networks, you're working with powerful signal modifiers in the brain for neuroplasticity. This is a real big deal. It's a real big deal. Working with people with limbic trauma loop or post-traumatic stress, there are a number of methodologies. And these days there's a lot, I'll make this shorter, but one of the steps is for a person to take a step back from the experience because they have to understand they can't believe every thought they have to be correct. I'm not saying all thoughts are incorrect, but some thoughts are incorrect, some emotions are incorrect, and some body sensations are incorrect. You're getting lied to by your limbic system. This is actually a deep subject that I plan an actual training on, like a 2-day training just on how to do this with the Neurolite. But you can't do this in the beginning. You have to get good with the basic stuff. The thing that needs to come after this whole thing, and I won't go any further, is actually you begin to reinforce the cognitive control network because it's the aspect of brain functioning that allows what we call the observer effect. It's where you're able to start to take a step back from your experience so that you're not immediately reactive to every thought, emotion, and sensation as though it's absolutely valid.
Is this defaulter?
That's the cognitive control network. The cognitive control network is reinforced when people need to be able to take a step back so that they can begin to observe experience and evaluate the credibility of it instead of taking every thought, emotion, and sensation as absolutely 100% accurate and valid. And in the beginning, most people can't be the neutral observer, so the first thing usually is to coax them into the curious observer. The curious observer still is owning the experience, but to a lesser degree. The neutral observer is willing to disassociate and evaluate it neutrally. But you can't go there that fast. And making that shift, the cognitive control network is involved in that. So in the methodologies, you begin to introduce cognitive control as part of a way of helping this person be attentive to their experience, but a little less passionately involved.